We've got quite a crowded webinar, about 25 people from across Australia and one or two internationals. So first, let me say thank you to the New Zealanders who are actually coping with the time difference. But to begin with, Sandy, this is possibly a question that's worth putting to you. And Ray, then chime in and help each other out. What are some of the warning signs that your marriage or kids are being sacrificed on the altar of church planting? Now, I know the pair of you have had decades of church planting experience now. What would you say are some of the warning signs that you know things are not going as well as they could be?
I think there's two big things within a family dynamic. One is if there's no time for each other, and certain things will come out of that. And the other is if there's no family fun together, if there's no sense of enjoying life because things are so busy. So I do remember, I was with the kids. They were very young when we started church, and I felt like I was with them 24/7. But you can be with somebody and still not give them attention. And I distinctly remember doing Play-Doh with the kids, and they were chatting away, and one of them in particular said to me, "Listen to me, Mummy." And I said, "I am listening." And then she very gently put both her hands either side of my face and turned my head to her, and she said, "No, I mean really listen to me, Mummy." So I think that was a bit of an eye-opener, that you can actually, as a mum, be with your children but not really be giving them your attention. So one of the things that we did very early on, and I think really helped us with our relationship with our children, was spend individual time together. And our youngest daughter still remembers and speaks fondly of the times that every Thursday morning Ray would take her to preschool, but he'd take her early, and they would sit and have a milkshake together. And over that year, that was their special time together on a Thursday morning. She was 4 at the time, and she still remembers all the flavours of milkshakes that they went through that year. So I think just valuing and carving out time for each of your children is very, very important.
So, Sandy,
From
you've identified the family pressures. From your perspective, Ray, what were some of the warning signs, if you like, when things weren't going well?
Well, a very clear warning sign was when your wife says to you after 6 months of church planting, "Ray, if it keeps going on like this, it's not going to work," which was a shot over the bow. And she sat down. I always remember so clearly in the lounge room. She did something she'd never done before. Sandy had sat at my feet, put her hands on my lap, and gently, it wasn't in an angry tone or any manipulation. It was a shot over the bow, really. It was saying, if it keeps going on like this, it's not going to work. At which point, if you asked me exactly what she meant, I wasn't sure whether it was A, I can't be a minister's wife, B, she was about to divorce me. Either one was neither attractive, so I tuned in. Now, really, the content was I wasn't taking my day off. That was the issue. And I'd call Sandy a low-maintenance wife, which is not a criticism of other wives, but that's her nature. It's not like she requires exorbitant amount of time. But she had, for 4 years at Moore College, said to me, I was working on a Hebrew model of time. If I took part of a day off, that was equivalent to a whole day. And what happened was I just presumed and presumed and presumed until finally she just drew a line in the sand. And I think, creating a culture where your wife's got enough confidence to be able to do that, and then hopefully having the discernment to not only listen, but you actually have to change your practice and build those fences around things like time together and not compromise them. Like, that's when they feel safe, and when they don't, it usually comes out in either a withdrawal or hypercriticalness. They'll be the symptoms, I think, that you'll see, and with cynicism. And once you start to see that, we're well and truly down a very bad road.
Yeah, so how do you actually manage to avoid developing that sort of point? I mean, you've given us the good warning signs. You actually have pressure within the family that your wife is talking to you. You've touched on one, which is the idea of the day off. What are the other things that you were keeping up or you learnt to keep up together in order to stop that sort of crisis, as you say, getting so far down the rabbit hole that you actually now you know you're in trouble? What are the things you used?
Well, I think the time together with the kids, one-on-one, that's critical. And maybe you can't, not everyone can do it every week, but make it a regular habit. I think being there emotionally, it's the notorious complaint of ministers' kids that their kids are physically, their parents and fathers are physically present but not emotionally present, and they always know. It's not like you can fake that one. And it's that own, it's that, you can do the letter of the law and kind of be there on significant amounts of time, but they just know whether you're there emotionally for them or not, and so being kind of emotionally engaged with them, wanting to be there. Now the battle with that is you've just got off a phone where someone's about to divorce, leave your church, criticize you or something, and you're having to sort of move from one zone to another. Often church offices and an early church plant, they're in the same home. We fortunately had a little granny flat that I turned into an office that I could demarcate. There's no time to debrief when you move out of your office into the challenges of family. So you just have to give yourself that 5 minutes where you need to remember what your first calling is, and that's to, after Jesus, love your wife and kids. And it's that sermon we need to keep giving ourselves. The other thing is making sure the date night thing happens on a regular basis. We didn't in the early days. Sandy found it hard, I think, to give the kids to others, but eventually we did. But I tell you, I got to the point where I was afraid to go on a date with Sandy on our own, wondering what are we going to talk about. Like, I've left it too long.
And is that reasonable? We're talking. I mean, part of the point of this webinar today is, in fact, to actually prepare people for reasonable costs too that will come your way. So, is it reasonable to assume within the first couple of years that there is going to be a real crunch on the couple relationship, that it might actually be very hard to achieve, the optimum day off each week, those sorts of things?
Well, you got to think. Sorry, Sam, you going to say something?
I was just going to say, often church planters tend to be young families, and so it's not just you changing and beginning a new ministry. Your whole family changes, and I think then trying to get time as a couple becomes hard because you've often relocated out from your natural support network. And so trying to establish that support network where you're comfortable leaving your kids with someone that you trust, and often having the money to be able to, do things as a couple becomes an issue. But whenever there's change in a family dynamic, there's always stress. So it's just the natural stresses that come from change that you're often experiencing because you're out of your comfort.
Mark, your question's like, is it inevitable, just the nature of an early church plant, whether you can juggle all the balls properly through that time?
Yeah, I think many people are wondering that.
Yeah, I think I think you can't postpone godliness. It's not like, for the sake of the kingdom, I somehow forfeit principles A, B, and D so I can achieve, F, L, and M. It's just not an option. You got to just, what was helpful for me, I did Titus early on and I realized, the requirement of an elder is that his children are believing. And I know you can take that word in different, faithful as opposed to of the faith, but it seemed to me that where my kids were at spiritually were my qualification and earned me the right to do what I was doing. And so once that was clear to me, every time I was tempted to presume on them, I kept thinking, I could lose my job if I don't do it. I know it wasn't the highest goal, but sometimes I had to remind myself that, if I keep presuming on them, then I'd be unfit for doing what I was doing, and then the church plant would really suffer. So sometimes it does mean you have to then trust God's purposes and His priorities, and you might, you mightn't grow as quickly. That might be the thing, but you'll grow on a better foundation.
Right. Okay. Well, listen. Actually,
Church plants come and go, but when you hit our age, the kids are all gone, and then you retire, and there's just you and the wife. And
want to still be enjoying that relationship.
You want a decent marriage by that stage.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause us now because speaking of growing, we've actually managed to bring Al back into the conversation. So that man who was going to make you feel like you were a little girl is back again. Al, can we hear you now?
Yes, Mark, I'm here.
Hang on,
Okay.
I'm listening to myself.
Hey, Ray and Sandy.
Hi, Al.
G'day, Al. How are you, mate? Good. Now, Ray.
Don't joke. Someone gave a sermon of mine to their cousin in the mid-90s, and the cousin said, "Your minister sounds like a girl."
Nice.
That's another story.
Guys, I'll just say what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop off now so I can let the real people have the conversation. But just so you know, there's a bunch of people who've just sent on some very encouraging comments to say how touched they are by hearing that a ministry couple like yourselves, Ray and Sandy, actually do struggle with the idea of the day off and yet how valuable it is. Thanks very much to Tara who sort of sent that encouragement into you guys. So look, I'll hand over to Al. He can carry on the interview. And if you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to use the question option on GoToWebinar, and we'll actually get to a point where we'll be asking you specifically. So fire them away, and I'll feed them to the guys as they go on. Over to you, Al.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Ray, Sandy, yeah, thanks for the stuff about family life. It's gold, and I wish I'd done it better 20 years ago from my point of view. I want to ask you a slightly different question about the first 2 years. When you start a church plant, you'll have people join you. Sometimes they're kind of brand new, they're not Christian, that's great, but sometimes they're Christian or kind of Christian and they come with a whole lot of baggage. One of the people listening has asked this question. In the first 2 years, do you need to be more tolerant of those pushing a different agenda or less? Or is there no kind of difference? So what do you do with people who turn up with a whole lot of their own agendas about what church should look like, or theological agendas, or whatever?
You know, small church plants, because that's what church plants normally are, they're smallish congregation. Small churches attract the loony, the disaffected, and those who want to keep church small. You just get a high percentage of them. And because they're more likely to get your time, because there's less relationships there, so they can usually get to the minister quicker, so you're more likely to hear that. And then there's that natural thing that happens that you feel more in a smaller group. I think it's still there in a bigger church, but the impact is felt less, and that is people come with their own experiences of what they had, which they really liked, especially like my first 4 years as a Christian in a church was my template, and it was so significant for me. I wanted every other church to be like that. Looking back now, I just think there were just major problems with how they conducted things. But at the time, that was my norm, and so in terms of a lot of church practice, you want to hold on to your vision. So much of this is how you conduct yourself. So people need to be heard and loved, and the teaching just doesn't happen at the pulpit or even in the Bible study group. It happens in the course of a conversation when you're trying to create another vision for them that perhaps they don't have, that's grounded in Scripture, and that kind of woos them in. And then sometimes when they start to see the fruit of that, you make those connections, and then they get excited by the forward progress that you're making. Now, when it comes to doctrinal matters, push them up front and early, so because they'll just be a pain if you don't. So early on, I realized I needed some form of newcomers time where I could work through issues, and I specifically went out of my way to pick up every controversial issue, from the women's issue, the predestination, where we stood in the charismatic issue, and because in the end what happened was, what I realized, people would join us and then discover we held some view 3 months later. They were emotionally connected to us, and then I have to spend all my time trying to work through the issue, and it was just labor intensive. Whereas, I used to call them my culling nights, where I'd say, look, this is what we're on about, this is what we believe, and at that point they could then make the decision whether they want to join us, but from an informed position.
So you're saying sorry, Sandy, go ahead.
It's like the pain, particularly for women in our women's ministry. We get these women coming along. We'd love them, they'd love us. But then certain issues divided, and because we were small, they pushed against it. So there were a number of women that it was a difficult journey with them. I mean, they left us and left us well, but I did in the end say to them, I don't think this church is where you are going to be happy. They wanted to change us, and yeah. And I think it's important when you get people who come with different agendas to make sure that as much as possible that you love them through the process.
But it's kind of like be clear on what you believe early. Like take your pain up front rather than more pain later on.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you hearing me clearly?
I can.
The other thing is, and so one's vision, one's doctrine, but you also want to be able to hear and not think that you can't be corrected as well. And so, sometimes you just don't want to believe all your own rhetoric, and so you've got to read the situation as it presents where you're at. So I came in with an ethnically specific model, Maltese. I was very dependent on the influence of people like Archie Poulos and the Greek Bible Fellowship. He stayed on a much more, for a long time, on a much more ethnic-specific model, sort of overtly. But I realised where I was at, I had to adapt and hear that we needed probably a broader base approach. Now theologically, I've actually shifted on that and think probably that's the ideal anyway. But at the time, I actually needed to hear what was at the ground level and just work out my responses on the ground without forfeiting my core principles.
Okay. I mean, I know Paul in the pastorals talks about being patient with those who disagree with you, doesn't he? So,
yeah.
Yeah.
We think because we've given a sermon on one topic that they believed it or heard it, and the fact that they probably weren't even there that Sunday, that's right. It in some cases, take the sovereignty of God and election. I realised talking to one guy, the God that he grew up with, as a Christian, completely Arminian, had no view that God had any involvement in suffering, and really it was almost like it was a different God for him. And that was going to change overnight. That was going to be just a walk through the scriptures over years in some cases, till they finally kind of come to the sense that, of course, it's the same God because they believe in the Lord Jesus, but it was a paradigm shift for him. Yeah, and that takes patience. You're right.
Yes. Can I pick up that the multicultural Maltese to multicultural thing? Got a question here. We're ministering to a group of Nepali. A group from the Nepali community through a translator. How long do you think we should offer meetings in Nepali? I guess the question about how long do you run multilingual church services and so on?
Well, behind the question is probably an assumption that you ought to move to an integrated English, or where people are in a multi-ethnic congregation. Is that like a specific Nepali congregation separate from the English-speaking congregation?
No, I haven't got much background here, mate. So just give us a general principle.
Okay, I'll just talk general principles then. Okay, yeah. I think I am theological. I have shifted. I think there is always a place in terms of mission for the homogeneous, ethnic specific. For as long as you've got people coming off the boat, you're going to need a place where this identifiable ethnic group needs an identifiable ethnic ministry to hear the word of God in their mother tongue. Like, that's a non-negotiable. Yep. And for as long as they're getting off the boat, so to speak, and literally in our case at Rudy Hill, we've got about 60 refugees every 6 weeks that are moving in. Wow. That's going to be the constant thing. So we've installed interpreter booths now. They're not quite operative yet, where there'll be 3 languages, but they'll be part of the congregation. We do have an ethnic specific congregation that remains, because it's essentially an outreach congregation for the Arabic-speaking people. But Nasri, who pastors that, has a commitment to as they hear of Jesus, hear the gospel, get converted. He actually wants them to be part of our multi-ethnic congregation, because that's the ideal, you know, helping people to recognize that we're all one in Christ. Yeah. So as for the Nepalese, I think you might need to keep running it, but what you want to do is keep creating avenues to not see it as an end point, but as a transition point, even though it might take some time for that transition to happen.
Okay, so the idea is people, kind of a front door for people's ethnic specific, but maturity looks like everyone's kind of big enough to be together.
Yep. The most segregated, you know, I heard Mark Demaz on this, and if, in terms of building multi-ethnic congregations, a book by Mark Demaz on that topic, that building healthy multi-ethnic congregations is the name of the book. He makes a good case, you know, for the fact that, you know, in the United States, the most segregated time in the United States now is at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And, you know, the whites go to white churches, the blacks go to black churches, the Hispanics go to Hispanic churches. And we're proclaiming a gospel for all nations, where we're all one in Christ, but we basically hang with our own tribe, just is violating, I think, the integrity of the gospel, especially now that the world is caught up and is leaving us behind in their agenda to actually bring nations together and cultures together.
Yes, yes, okay. Now, along the lines of that, for who's going to do that work, another question here, how can we encourage more bicultural Australians to consider full-time ministry to non-English speaking cultures? So I'm assuming they mean people from a migrant background in some way, have a second language to English. Any ideas about how to get them out into the gospel workforce?
You're right. There's sometimes a greater... You think that would be the group most likely to want to do it. And sometimes it's the group that resists more. Partly, I think they've inherited their family immigrant mindset, which, you know, you come to the new country and, you know, you want to build your Taj Mahal and a house for every one of your kids, especially, say, the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern worldview, you know. But I, you know, the early days of MBM, I spent all my days, you know, casting visions for Christians from non-English speaking backgrounds and trying to remind them that their ethnicity was a gift and that they had an opportunity to reach a group that were hard to reach and more likely to be reached by someone of their own kind. And so, you know, the normal stuff about getting people into full-time ministry operates, but adding that particular vision that they have something unique to contribute. They know what it's like to live in the overlap of two cultures in a way that maybe an Aussie finds it a little bit harder to grasp. And, you know, we had like one Assyrian guy, he traveled a long time to get to us, he traveled a distance to get to us, and eventually he chose a local Anglican church, and then about 3 years later he was back with us. And I said, Sarkis, what are you doing back? And he said, you know, the pastor there was brilliant, you know, the Bible study leader was great, but he said, I feel like you know me. And there's a sense where I could speak to him from the inside. And so that's not to say that he shouldn't have stayed and all that issue, but it's just a reminder that people with bicultural backgrounds have just got a unique opportunity, and just keep casting that vision with them, especially the fact that Australia is becoming so multi-ethnic now.
Do you think, Ray, do you think that applies to people who were born here? I talked to a young Asian guy the other day about the third culture thing, and he said he doesn't really feel at home in Australian culture, doesn't really feel at home in Chinese culture, and I mentioned the third culture thing, and his eyes lit up.
Yeah, I think that's right. To be honest, you know, a lot of people who are Aussies don't feel like they fit in too. You know, we need to sort of sometimes remember most people don't feel like they belong. I mean, it's a core problem of getting people feeling like church is home for them anyway.
Yep.
So, but that has its unique elements to it. So that's right. They're not like their grandparents, and they're not like their parents. And whenever you get that category, which it's shared with others, you've got an opportunity for ministry there, and then trying to tweak ministry in that way. But you're right. It's not a question of when they came. So I've got people who get off the boat and yet really adjust well to a new culture. They embrace it and are proactive. Then I get people who were born here but are more ethnic than their grandparents from the old country. And you get different kind of nuances that develop.
Right. Is there a factor that people from a non-Anglo culture just feel like they have something in common, just actually kind of being non-Anglo?
Yeah, because it's just got to do with you live. I just describe it as the overlap of two cultures, and so there's the Aussie culture, which, you know, growing up being told you're a wog, you know, there's certain things, you know, you got your mum who's got a thick accent. When your friends come and visit, you know, they laugh at, or you know, they're kind of that sense that makes you feel like you're not like them. And you know, you got stories that are connected with another land, you know, and that your parents will tell and pass on, and your extended family. We've got a very broad extended family, and it's interesting. When I went to my first church, which was a good church, St Paul's, Wentworthville, I invited all my Aussie friends, but it was like I couldn't bring any of my relatives. I just feel like the jump was so great. Now I witnessed to them, but I felt like the gap was so much larger, because partly who was there and not there, and partly the denominational issue, of course, and partly just the cultural differences.
Yep. Well, it's great to talk more about this, because the world has come to us, and there are some of us who can reach different cultures. Ray, thank you for your time. I need to hand back over to Mark as he winds up this webinar. Thanks a lot, mate.
Excellent, great to thank you.
Thank you.
And keep going for it, guys. It's an awesome privilege, and you know, there is a world out there that is not treating God the way He deserves to be treated, and for His sake and for their sake, I'm so encouraged that you're actually doing really hard work in church planning in very different and difficult contexts. So much encouraged by that.
Actually, if you can, yes, I'm back in. But guys, the end has been somewhat brought forward too quickly. We're actually just moving to question time now. In fact, we've been racking up some questions.
Sorry, I misunderstood that.
No worries.
It was a bit quick.
Okay, I've got it.
You're not off that easy. What can I say? Actually,
was there something I said, Al, or didn't say?
Okay, I miss. Sorry, it's hard to get good staff these days, isn't it? I'm sorry.
Well, listen,
My mistake.
While I'm here, let me ask the first question. We've actually got a question from Dan Godden, and it's for Sandy and Ray. That being, while you were starting the church, and there's a lot of people here who really want to hear about those first 2 years. So we've had a nice excursion into multicultural ministry. But talking to you as a couple, how did you balance what was happening at the church, while at the same time, and here's the million-dollar question, sometimes disagreeing in private over the strategy of what you should be doing? Who would like to answer that one first?
I'm not sure what you meant by disagreeing behind. Well, I mean, there were lots of disagreements behind the scenes, but
over the kids.
Yeah, but about the actual ministry itself, Sandy probably, you didn't have kind of strong opinions. You just sort of
at that stage,
surviving as a mother.
Yeah, I had very, very young kids. My role in the first 2 years was really everything. The first year, everything was in our house. Every meeting, church was in our house on Sunday evening. So everything was there. So my role in that first year was to make sure that there were quieter days in the week, so that we could cope with the really, really busy days in the week, and just keeping a structure for the kids. But almost every day except for, I don't think Monday we had anyone in the house, and our day off we didn't have anyone in the house. But every other day the house was used for ministry. So in those early days, it was the conflict came when I felt I had no space, and we had too much going on. But in terms of how ministry was going, Ray, you know, we prayed together as a couple, and we read the Bible with the kids, but we didn't meet to discuss church as such. We had a core team that we met together to discuss things.
So, I mean, you know, it's those conversations you have. We did have conversations, but they were never formalised.
No, it was on the run.
that always, you know, wherever you are, you're talking. And part of the issue is you have to create time where you're not talking church. That becomes important as well, for the sake of the family. But yeah. Sorry, Mark, I'm not sure we probably picked up the answer, the heart of the question.
No, I think you did actually.
Hello?
They were talking. Sorry, you can hear me now? I'm assuming you can
Yep,
hear
Yes.
me now.
yep,
Yeah.
go for it.
Look, no, I think you did. And in fact, there's a follow-up question which Dan wants to ask. What are I mean, you've talked in a sense about how you two have dealt with strategy and challenges in the first and second year. What about the challenges for the church planning support team? What questions should they be asking, and what sort of stresses were they undergoing in the first couple of years?
Can I just ask, there's a thought that came to my mind about just husband and wife. Different couples, there are different styles of relating. So there are some spouses that need to be very involved in the whole process, and it's just the way they're made up. For them to feel like they're part of it. Sandy probably didn't need that as much. She just knew where her circle of responsibility was, and I would share to the degree that she wanted to know stuff, but really she was not that kind of a wife that really needed to sort of work through. She was happy for me to carry stuff and not unload on her, and I'm the sort of guy that really, if I come back from something, I don't have the need. And some guys have the need to debrief with their spouse, and that's not the way I'm wired. So you've got to work out how you're wired and how that works out between the two couples, because that's where the tension can be created, where some guys overshare and then the wife is hearing all the problems but unable to act, and that has its own tensions. Other wives needing to know, like they feel more loved by being informed and very involved in the process. So it's kind of reading how you relate to each other and what's helpful will probably be different from couple to couple. Now,
Right.
as for the actual core group, I
Well,
think one of the
that would be the
issues...
same thing, isn't it? I take it that you're going to have to understand those personalities as well within your core group. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you're forever, you're forever casting the vision in creative ways, encouraging them. I mean, you spend a lot of time encouraging people, because especially out in the West, there's just kind of like, I shouldn't say in the West, I don't know whether it's any more here than anywhere else, but encouraging what they do and valuing their contribution becomes really critical, because they get tired, and making sure you're not pushing them beyond what they can bear. For the sake of our own needs, especially male pastors, we're type A. We want the church to grow to 1,000 in 2 weeks, and that kind of, without unwittingly, we can actually put a lot of pressure even on the core group. So you're wanting them to go forward. You're wanting to value a high work ethic, but you want to be careful that they're in a set of relationships, like they've got their own families, and you want to make sure that they're not neglecting them in the process as well. And those stories need to come out, and so you're checking with them how they're going.
That's a really important question, because Tara has a follow-up to that. She wants to know, during the first 2 years, how did you handle disappointments within your core group? The idea that people who were core to establishing the church might decide to leave, or not even necessarily on bad terms, but the fact that
Yeah.
those people who are holding it together just seem to be drifting apart. How did you handle that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I just think, name it for what it is, and just kind of put words that say it's discouraging, isn't it? And saying, early on I had to talk about, this is when we're going to work out whether we're going to be a cult or not, because cults don't ever let people go well. And that the kingdom of God is bigger than our 22 people or our 6 people, wherever you're at. And so we want to encourage, and we want people to leave well. And I said, but then drawing a circle around the privilege of being able to say, we were there in the first year and the second year, and 10 years from now when we look back, we are going to be so glad that we hung in there. And so reframing it, as well as constantly training them to think theologically about disappointment, and then airing with others, giving them permission to share their grief and disappointments. And so you walk with them in that, and then at the same time, it's God working in all things for the good of those who love Him, and that God's purposes won't be thwarted because persons, these particular people found that the journey was a bit too tough for them, or for whatever reason had to leave.
Sandy,
And I think letting people, yeah.
Sorry, I was just saying, sorry to interrupt there, guys. I'm just with an eye on the clock and the questions are piling up here.
Yeah.
A question for you, Sandy. Is part of being, part of the ministry team, and particularly being the wife of the pastor, is part of your job being the glue to hold the emotional stability of not only the pastor, but I think people who might, I think this relates to your point, Ray, about creating an opportunity or a space for people to make their concerns known. Sandy, did you find that you were a back channel to that, or did you find that you were a glue somehow in between the relationship with people?
I think Ray is relationally stronger than me, so people would be drawn more to Ray than to me. I'm more male and he's more female, if I can put it like that.
Well, that would
Here
explain
we go to the high
divorce.
voice again. It's not just that, Sandy. Sandy's got one time I was using Sandy as an example for the limits of body language and how we need words to understand God, for example. We need him to speak. And I just happened to mention about, say, take Sandy, for example. This is with her permission, by the way.
Permission?
Can I underline that, with her permission? I said, Sandy has a downturned mouth, and which means you might, unless she intentionally smiles, you may think she's upset with you.
All these people came
All
out.
these people afterwards came up. I'm so glad you said that, Ray. I thought Sandy was upset with me.
So in saying that, I think people, over the years, I've had to learn to draw people out. Ray does it naturally. I think where I'm the glue is in terms of managing the home and doing all the background stuff to keep everything organised, and food being bought, things being organised by a particular time. So I'm much more of a manager. So in that sense, I was the glue, and naturally, that's my natural gift. So I think one of the things that I did like in the early days was that as a couple we were church planting. Ray was the church planter and I was the supporter in that, and then Ray just allowed me to work out what my gifts were, and my priority is always to the family, and then anything outside of that was icing on the cake. So I think in terms of, I felt very free to try and work out where I should be serving, rather than a pre I felt like I was free to work out what I should be doing.
I think we need to be. I suppose most church planners are optimists, but I'm sure there are some who aren't. But it's a thing about seeing a negative situation and being able to flip it for an opportunity. And theologically, God turns the sins of men into the praise of God, and He works in all things, good and bad. So it's kind of trying to always find, how is God going to be glorified through this, whether it's a great event or a sorrowful event, and putting that on the agenda, I think is a helpful way of going forward.
Okay, well, speaking of negative situations and flipping them for the positive, we've got a question here from Andrew, and we'll probably make this our second last question because everyone's been very patient because of the technical difficulties we've gone over time. But how did you prepare, Andrew wants to know, your core group and supporter network for the spiritual warfare that early stage plants attract? So in terms of the stresses and the tensions, and particularly the spiritual pressure that would come in, how did you prepare everybody for that?
Well, you got to clearly understand. I really didn't have a clue what I was doing. Perhaps if we put that one on the table first of all. So,
how would you like to have prepared them?
You got no idea what I didn't know.
Yeah.
You did meet with Sylvia for the year beforehand and prayed.
Thank you. That's a good reminder. So there was an ancient saint in the home church that was going to join us, who I thought she'd make up the numbers, but proved to be, one of the great godly saints of our church that had a great prayer ministry. So I prayed every week with her. The
year before we started.
I think it's opening the Bible, and whenever Matt, I don't know how much I did beforehand, to be honest. We would have talked about the cost of commitment and the challenges that come in being part of a core group, as well as the privileges. But a lot of it was on, as things came up, constantly getting to think Christianly about it, being honest with disappointments, celebrating the joys, and seeing that it's a journey of teaching along the way. And then, you're doing one-to-one stuff with people, because, people, whether they're part of a church plan or not, their Christian life is going to go up and down anyway. We need to remember that. You don't want to so make the church planning experience unique that it's like these things wouldn't happen otherwise. Christian lives just go up and down. It's the nature of it. Emotionally, we're up and down. We have joys and sorrows. People still lose loved ones, whether they're in a core group or not. Just talk to any missionary. And so it's not so much what we did beforehand, but I think what we did along the way that was more critical. Because, it's a bit like pre-marriage counselling. It doesn't do all that much impact. It's only once they hit the brick wall that you journey through them with the difficulties. Yeah.
Well, listen, our final question comes from Dave, and it actually flows on quite neatly from that. In being prepared to talk to them, you're actually presuming, well, I guess we're assuming that there is going to be some sort of accountability context between you and the core group, or that you're going to be either following up or meeting up with core group members and other members of the planning team. What does that look like, and what sort of questions would you be asking of them in order to sustain them or help them or make them think more critically of what they're doing in their role?
Well, I always start with the person, because it's who we are before what we do. So I'm always interested in how they're going in their walk with Christ. So questions to do with their devotional life, opportunities where they could, where they're witnessing or not witnessing to. Because often, they'll have context that they don't even in the core group, they're not even thinking. And I said, have you ever thought about, inviting that person to church? No, I haven't really. And I thought, I don't know why you weren't thinking that, but they weren't. And so, helping them in their own Christian walk within that, and in their relationships, so their personal walk with Christ, their relationships, so spouses, children, because that's what hijacks ministry all the time. If you don't get the basic stuff right, you've got no platform upon which to reach out to others. And then in their ministry, just talking to them about, how it's going, reminding them about why and what they're doing, what's the goal and the purpose that's driving it, and celebrating with them as well as grieving with them. And then it may be along the way, when it comes to their ministries, sometimes they're doing things for a year, and then, but as the church grows, you want to help them find out perhaps where their sweet spot is, where they really got a really niche to minister in, and maybe start talking in the future about where they may take the next step within the same sphere of ministry or move in another area. So there's some of the things, but I always want to start with who they are, how they're going, and work from there.
No, I guess actually. Sorry, Sandy, go ahead.
I think helping people to see how God has made them, and not to compare themselves with other people within the core. So finding out what their gifts are, because they will, if you're exercising your gifts, you'll tend to enjoy what you're actually doing rather than working against the way that God has made you, and also realizing that your plate is different to somebody else's. So people can cope with multiple things, and some people can cope with one thing. And they're not any less part of the core group if, in that, that sort of respect. So trying to help people to see where their gifts are and what size plate they've got, and celebrating that with them.
So then, some of them, sorry, just on that, we had one guy, he battled with depression, and he really struggled to release his wife because he felt intimidated by her success. Successful ministry. She was effective in the various ministries. So, it's making sure he stays on his antidepressants, because in his case, he had a family story that discouraged him from wanting to take drugs. It was like a weakness. So I often had that conversation about how you're going with your med. You're on your antidepressants. Are you taking them consistently? Helping them to think Christianly about that. It's an act of love for himself and for his family. So you're working with them in those sort of up close journeys as well.
Well, Ray, Sandy, we'd just like to thank you for being part of this morning with us, particularly just giving us an insight into the early days. In fact, what sounds like very much a no-holds-barred insight into your own particular struggles as a couple, and also how you were dealing with your core group and how that reflected out into the church. So we're very thankful for that insight. And thanks everybody for attending this morning, and also for the questions that came through. And mainly, I'd like to say from my end, thanks very much for your patience with the technical side of things. We had a few bugs this morning that are unusual, and as we get through them, maybe we'll either just repeat the bugs and be better at them, or maybe we'll get them out altogether. Ray and Sandy, thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with you in terms of further webinars in the future.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
See you, Mark. See you, Al.
See you guys. Now, before we have everybody switch off, I'd just like to actually ask you to take a moment to consider what's coming up next in the Geneva Push calendar. If you are in Sydney on June 12 and you have some time, we'd really like to encourage you to get along to St Philip's York Street to be part of the 5M's network event. The whole structure, 5M structure, can be a little confusing for some people, and yet it's actually been quite powerful in church planting. And Andrew Hurd and Toby Neal and Dan Godden will be there to talk about the 5M structure, how they've used it as the axis for building healthy church plants, and also, and more importantly, mission-minded churches, ones that are actually keen to plant more churches. That's on in Sydney on June 12th. All of the details are on the Geneva Push website. It's $40 a full ticket. If you can qualify somehow as a student, you get $25. So if I were you, I would be thinking about all the things you might be studying and getting along to that event. Also, if you look ahead in terms of our webinar calendar, you'll see on the same events page that we have the next one coming up with Peter Coe. Now, this is really going to be interesting for those people who had lots of multicultural questions this morning for Ray, and we were feeding those through as we could, but you might have more to go. Peter Coe has done a lot of thinking in this area, and he will be dealing with traps for ethnic planters, which is not to say that you are an ethnic person and you're trying to plant, but if you're sitting down to try and work out an ethnic-based ministry, then you really need to think through a lot more than have we got the right morning tea. So Peter Coe and Al Stewart will be talking about that on June 27 at 9:30 a.m. and we look forward to chatting with them then. And we'd like to give a last big hoy to EA Insurance and thank them for all their support. They really do make this entire event possible by picking up the background costs. And also they provide a service to church planners, which we think is quite valuable in terms of insurance for organisations around Australia and in fact the world, but also and in particular a special eye for church planting and the particular costs associated with that. So if insurance is a bugbear for you and you're not sure how to deal with it, we'd encourage you to have a chat to them. Go to ea.org.au and they will take care of you and sort of guide you through the process. Finally, guys, this is the end of this particular webinar, but we'd love to have your help to try and make it better. So you'll receive in the next couple of days a link to a survey. It's 4 questions. If it takes you 4 minutes, I'd be surprised. If you can answer those, they'll be really helpful to us and allow us to sort of better shape the webinars as they come in the future. Thanks again for your patience, and we hope that we'll be able to see more of you joining us again in the next webinar in a few weeks' time. Goodbye.